We think we know the Middle Ages. We picture knights, castles, and kings. We picture women as silent figures in the background, damsels in distress, powerless wives, obedient nuns. But what if that picture is wrong? What if the 1,000 years we dismiss as the Dark Ages were lit by the brilliance of women whose wisdom we have simply forgotten? These were women who ran businesses, commanded armies, wrote books that challenged the Pope, and pioneered medical fields. They did this in a world designed to keep them quiet, a world where their legal rights were few and their voices were meant to be unheard. Yet they spoke, they built, they healed, they led. They found ways to hold power not in spite of their circumstances, but because of them. Their lives were not easy. They faced plague, war, and systemic oppression. But through it all, they developed a kind of practical, resilient wisdom that we rarely talk about. What did a 12th century abbess know about leadership that a modern CEO could learn from? What could a 15th century female writer teach us about fighting misinformation? How did women with no formal power manage to influence politics, science, and art? Their wisdom isn't found in grand philosophical treatises. It's woven into letters, poems, medical texts, and the records of their daily lives. It is a wisdom of survival, of community, of quiet resistance, and of profound insight. We have forgotten it. Maybe it's time we remembered. Number 22. What if your weakness is actually your greatest strength? We live in a world that tells us to be strong, to hide our vulnerabilities, to project confidence even when we feel none. But what if the very things society labels as weaknesses are actually portals to a different kind of power? Medieval women lived this question every day. They were legally and socially defined as the weaker sex. This was not a suggestion. It was a foundational principle of their world, reinforced by law, religion, and custom. They couldn't own property in the same way as men. They couldn't hold most public offices. Their testimony was often considered less reliable. They were weak. But some of them didn't fight that label. They leaned into it. They transformed it. Consider the anchoress. This was a woman who chose to be permanently enclosed in a small room or cell attached to a church. She was walled in, sometimes with a funeral rite performed at her enclosure to signify her death to the world. From the outside, it looks like the ultimate act of submission, the ultimate weakness. A woman literally imprisoning herself. But from the inside, it was a radical act of autonomy. By embracing complete physical confinement, an anchoress escaped all the social obligations placed on women. She had no husband to obey, no children to raise, no household to manage. Her weakness, her inability to participate in the male world, became her liberation. Julian of Norwich was one of these women. She lived in the 14th century, a time of immense chaos with the Black Death and peasant revolts. In her small self, she had a window that looked into the church and another that looked onto the street. She became a spiritual counselor for her entire community. People from all walks of life came to her window for advice. Her physical weakness and isolation gave her immense spiritual authority. It was in this state of weakness that she wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book written in English by a woman. In it, she developed a theology of, radical love and hope, even describing a motherly aspect of God. This was a revolutionary idea, born not in a powerful monastery or university, but in a small dark room inhabited by a weak woman. She used her prescribed confinement to create a space for profound intellectual and spiritual freedom. This wasn't just about mystics. A noble woman's weakness and inability to fight in battle meant she had to master other skills. She learned diplomacy, negotiation, and estate management. While her husband was away at war, she was the one running the castle, managing the finances, and holding the community together. Her power was indirect, but it was real. Her supposed weakness forced her to cultivate a different, often more sustainable set of strengths. The world told her she was a pawn, so she learned to play the entire chessboard. This wisdom asks us to look at our own perceived limitations. The things we are told make us less than. The things we try to hide. What if we stop fighting them and instead ask what they can teach us? What if the sensitivity we're told is a weakness is actually a source of deep empathy and connection? What if the lack of a formal title forces us to build influence through trust and community, which is a more durable form of power anyway? The medieval woman's secret was not in becoming a man. It was in finding the unique power that lay hidden in being a woman, even in a world that devalued her for it. What else do we not know? How many women who appeared to be conforming to their roles were actually engaged in a subtle subversion of them? If the texts of women like Julian were copied and preserved by male scribes, how much of their original, possibly more radical, message was softened or erased? And what forms of weakness in our own society hold a hidden power we have not yet learned to see? Number 21. Is it possible to argue with God and win? We often think of faith, especially in the medieval period, as a matter of silent, unquestioning obedience. The church was the ultimate authority, and God's will was absolute. To question was to sin. To argue was to commit heresy. But the records left by some medieval women tell a different story. They show a faith that was not passive, but active. It was a relationship, and in any real relationship, there are arguments. These women did not just accept their fate, they wrestled with it, they questioned God. They demanded answers. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess from the 12th century, is a perfect example. She was a polymath, a composer, a writer, a philosopher, and a naturalist. She was also a mystic who claimed to receive visions from God. But she did not just passively receive them. Her writings show a mind actively engaging, questioning, and interpreting. When the church authorities in Mons placed her entire convent under an interdict banning them from receiving sacraments or singing their hymns because she had allowed an excommunicated man to be buried in their cemetery, she did not simply accept it. She fought back. She wrote a blistering letter to the prelates, arguing that their command to stop making music was contrary to God's will. She essentially told them that God wanted music, and they were standing in his way. It was a risky, audacious move. She was arguing theology with the men in power, using their own framework to critique them. And she won. The interdict was lifted. Then there was Marjorie Kempe, a middle-class English woman from the 15th century. Her book, the Book of Marjorie Kempe, is considered the first autobiography in the English language. It is a raw, emotional, and deeply personal account of her spiritual life. Marjorie was not a quiet, demure mystic. She was loud, she wept uncontrollably in public, she challenged priests on their sermons. And she had long, detailed conversations with Jesus in her visions. In these conversations, she was not always supplicant. She was conversational, sometimes even chiding. She negotiated with God about her life, her family, and her spiritual path. Her faith was not a one-way street of commands from on high, it was a dialogue. A messy, complicated, and intensely real relationship where she felt she had a voice. She was arrested multiple times on suspicion of heresy, but she always managed to argue her way to freedom, defending her personal relationship with God against the institutional church. This wisdom is not about atheism or a lack of faith, it's about a different kind of faith. A faith that is strong enough to withstand doubt. A faith that is personal enough to allow for anger and questions. These women believed in a God that was big enough to handle their arguments. They understood that blind obedience was not the same as true devotion. True devotion required the engagement of their whole selves, their intellect, their emotions, their doubts. By daring to argue, they forged a faith that was uniquely their own, not just something handed down to them. They teach us that questioning is not a sign of a weak faith, but a strong one. It's the difference between being a subject and being a partner. What can we learn from this today? We are often told to trust the experts, to follow the rules, to accept things as they are. This medieval wisdom challenges that. It suggests that true understanding and true commitment come from wrestling with ideas, not from passively accepting them. It gives us permission to question, to argue, to demand a faith or a system or a relationship that makes sense to us, not just one that asks for our silent compliance. But what don't we know? How many women were executed for heresy simply because their personal argumentative faith was misunderstood by male authorities? Were the conversations with God, recorded by women like Marjorie, a socially acceptable way to express their own intellectual and theological ideas without being accused of presumption? And did their male confessors and scribes edit their accounts to make them seem more compliant than they actually were? Number 20. What if the best way to change the world is to create a new one beside it? When you are faced with a system that will not let you in, you have two choices. You can spend all your energy trying to break down the door, or you can build your own house next door. Many medieval women, shut out of the formal structures of power in the church and society, chose the second option. And they didn't just fight the system, they created parallel systems where they could live, work, and thrive on their own terms. The Beguines are perhaps the most stunning example of this. Emerging in the 12th century in Northern Europe, the Beguine movement was a social and spiritual revolution created by and for women. These were lay women who wanted to live a life of religious devotion without taking formal vows or retreating from the world as nuns. They were not wives and they were not nuns. They were a third way, something that the rigid social structure of the time had no category for. Beguines lived together in communities called beguinages. These were often walled enclosures within a city, containing a church, a hospital, and individual houses. They took no permanent vows, so they were free to leave and marry if they chose. They did not answer to a bishop or a male religious order. They elected their own leaders and managed their own finances. They supported themselves through their own labor, often in the textile industry, and they were deeply involved in charity and social work in their cities, running hospitals and caring for the poor. The Grand Beguinage of Louvain, in modern-day Belgium, was a town within a town, housing hundreds of women in a self-sufficient, self-governing community. This was a radical act. In a world that offered women two primary paths, marriage or the cloister, the Beguines created a third. They created a space where a woman could be independent, she could be educated, have a meaningful career, and live a spiritual life without surrendering her autonomy to a husband or a male-dominated church hierarchy. The movement was incredibly successful. By the 13th century, there were hundreds of thousands of Beguines across Europe. They created a world where women were in charge. They didn't overthrow the patriarchy. They just built an alternative to it. This wisdom is about the power of creative institution building. It suggests that sometimes the most effective form of resistance isn't direct confrontation, but strategic withdrawal and creation. When the existing models don't serve you, invent a new one. This applies to so much in our modern world. If corporate culture is toxic, maybe the answer isn't just to fight for reforms, but to build a cooperative, worker-owned business. If the political system feels broken, maybe the answer is to focus on building strong, resilient local communities. The Beguines teach us that we don't always have to ask for a seat at the table. Sometimes we can build our own table, and when we do, we can set our own rules. Their movement was eventually viewed with suspicion by the church, which was uncomfortable with a large group of independent, unsupervised women. Some Beguines, like Marguerite Porete, who wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, were condemned as heretics and executed. Their power was a threat. But for centuries, they offered a real, living alternative for thousands of women. They proved that it was possible to live differently. What are the gaps in this story? How did these communities of women navigate internal conflicts and leadership disputes without a formal external authority to appeal to? What were the day-to-day economic strategies that allowed them to remain independent in a world where men controlled most capital? And how many other smaller, less formal communities of women existed that were never documented, leaving no trace in the historical record? Number 19, could your kitchen be a pharmacy? We separate food and medicine. We have grocery stores for one and pharmacies for the other. If we're sick, we see a doctor who prescribes a chemical compound. But for most of history, this separation did not exist. For a medieval woman, the garden was a clinic and the kitchen was a laboratory. The knowledge of how to use food, herbs, and spices to maintain health and treat illness was a critical part of her domestic skill set. This was not folk magic. It was a deep, practical, and often life-saving science passed down through generations. The Lady of the Manor was not just a hostess. She was the primary healthcare provider for her entire household, which could include her family, servants, and even workers on the estate. Her receipt book was not just for recipes. It was a medical textbook filled with instructions for making cordials, poultices, salves, and infusions. She knew that rose hips were rich in vitamin C and could be made into a syrup to prevent scurvy. She knew that willow bark contained salicin, the basis for modern aspirin, and could be used to treat fevers and pain. She knew that garlic had antiseptic properties, and that a poultice of comfrey could help set broken bones. Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensively on this topic in her 12th century text, Physica. She cataloged hundreds of plants, trees, and animals, detailing their medicinal properties. She prescribed a specific diet, believing that certain foods like spelt, fennel, and chestnuts promoted a state of viriditas, or greening power and vitality, while others hindered it. For Hildegard, the food you ate was not just fuel, it was information for your body. It could bring you into balance or throw you into a state of disease. This was a holistic view of health where diet, environment, and spiritual well-being were all interconnected. This knowledge was not limited to the elite. Peasant women had their own extensive knowledge of local herbs and wild plants. They knew which mushrooms were safe, which berries were poisonous, and which leaves could soothe a cough or stop bleeding. With antibiotics and few effective medical treatments, this wisdom was the difference between life and death. When were the keepers of this knowledge? They were the healers, the herbalists, the midwives. When the professional, university-trained male physicians of the time were still relying on bloodletting and astrology, women were practicing a form of practical, evidence-based medicine rooted in the natural world. This forgotten wisdom challenges our modern, compartmentalized approach to health. It reminds us that our bodies are not machines that can be fixed with isolated chemical interventions. They are ecosystems deeply connected to the food we eat and the environment we live in. It urges us to see the medicinal power in everyday foods. A cup of ginger tea to soothe an upset stomach. A spoonful of honey for a sore throat. A diet rich in colorful vegetables to reduce inflammation. These are not just old wives' tales, they are echoes of a time when women understood that the first line of defense against illness was a well-stocked kitchen and a thriving garden. But what have we lost? As medicine became a formal, male-dominated profession, how much of this female-held knowledge was dismissed as superstition and deliberately wiped out during the witch trials? What effective plant-based remedies known to medieval women have been lost to time, waiting to be rediscovered? And are there connections between diet and chronic illness that our modern science is only just beginning to understand, which a 12th century nun already knew? Number 18 is your story a weapon? Who gets to write history? For most of human existence, the answer has been simple: the winners. And the men. The official story of the world, the chronicles of kings, the records of battles, the theological doctrines, was written by a small elite group of male scribes, monks, and scholars. In this official story, women were largely absent or relegated to the footnotes. Their experiences, their thoughts, their contributions were deemed unimportant. But some medieval women knew that if you let someone else tell your story, you lose. So they picked up the pen. They understood that telling your own story is an act of power. It is a weapon. Cristina Pisan was a master of this. Born in Italy in 1364, she moved to the French court, and after being widowed at 25 with 3 children to support, she did something revolutionary. She became a professional writer. This was unheard of for a woman at the time. She wasn't just writing poetry, she was writing political theory, military strategy, and biography. But her most famous work was a direct response to the rampant misogyny she saw in the literature of her day. A popular and influential poem, The Romance of the Rose, depicted women as manipulative, deceitful, and morally corrupt. Christine was furious, so she wrote a counter-argument. In 1405, she published the Book of the City of Ladies. In this groundbreaking text, she imagines building a symbolic city, a safe haven for women, populated by heroic and virtuous women from history, mythology, and her own time. She systematically refutes the misogynistic arguments of male writers, one by one, using logic, reason, and historical evidence. She tells the stories of women warriors, women scholars, women artists, and women saints. She was not just defending women, she was creating a new narrative. She was writing women back into history. It was one of the first overtly feminist texts in Western literature. She was using her story and the stories of other women to fight a cultural war. On a more personal level, there was Marjorie Kempe. As we've seen, her autobiography was a radical act. But why did she create it? She was illiterate, so she dictated her life story to a scribe. She did it because she was constantly being misunderstood and attacked for her public displays of religious devotion. The authorities saw her as a heretic, and her neighbors saw her as a nuisance. By creating a book, her book, she could frame her own life. She could explain her actions, articulate her spiritual beliefs, and present her side of the story directly to the reader. It was an attempt to control her own narrative in a world that was trying to define her as either mad or evil. She was ensuring that her version of her life would survive. This wisdom is about the power of narrative. The stories we tell matter. They shape how we see the world and our place in it. For centuries, women were the subjects of stories told by men. Christine de Pizan and Marjorie Kempe, in their very different ways, seized the role of author. They understood that if a story is being told about you that is untrue or unjust, the most powerful thing you can do is tell a better one, a truer one, your own. Today we see this playing out everywhere, in social media, in independent publishing, in the fight for whose history gets taught in schools. This medieval wisdom reminds us that the act of documenting our own experiences is not self-indulgent. It is a vital act of political and cultural resistance. It is how we ensure we are not erased. But what stories have been completely lost? For every Christine de Pizan who had the resources to write and preserve her work, how many thousands of women had equally powerful stories that were never written down? How many women's letters, diaries, and personal accounts were discarded by male heirs who saw them as worthless? And are we sure that the texts we do have, like Marjorie Kempe's, were not shaped and censored by the male scribes who wrote them down? Number 17, how do you wield power when you have no authority? Authority is formal. It comes with a title, a crown, a uniform. Power is different. Power is the ability to make things happen. Medieval women, with very few exceptions, had no formal authority. But many of them had immense power. They mastered the art of influence, a subtle and often invisible force that shaped kingdoms, ended wars, and built cathedrals. They knew that you don't need to be the king to control the king. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a genius of this kind of power. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, she was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in 12th century Europe. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, but her titles were often secondary to her real influence. She could not lead armies into battle, but she could finance them. She could not make laws, but she could influence the men who did. She was a master of what we might now call soft power. She did this through several channels. First, patronage. Eleanor was a major patron of the arts, particularly the new literature of courtly love. By funding poets and troubadours, she shaped the culture of her time. She promoted an ideal of chivalry and romance that elevated the status of noblewomen, giving them a new kind of social and moral power within the court. Second, diplomacy. She was a skilled negotiator, using her family connections across Europe to forge alliances and broker peace deals. She was the one working behind the scenes, managing relationships, and ensuring the stability of the realm. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she wielded power through her children. As the mother of two future kings of England, Richard the Lionheart and John, she had their ears and their loyalty. When her sons rebelled against their father, King Henry II, she supported them. When Richard was on crusade, she effectively ruled England in his name. Even in her old age, she was a political force, traveling across the Pyrenees to arrange a strategic marriage for her granddaughter. Eleanor's life shows that power does not always reside on the throne. It often resides in the person who has the king's trust, respect, and affection. This kind of influence was not limited to queens. An abbess like Hildegard of Bingen had no formal political authority, but she corresponded with and gave advice to popes, emperors, and kings. Her moral and spiritual authority gave her a platform to speak truth to power, and they listened. A merchant's wife might have no role in the city council, but by managing the family finances and building relationships with the wives of other merchants, she could be central to the economic and social network of her town. This wisdom teaches us to look for power in unconventional places. It is a lesson in the difference between a title and true influence. Authority can be given and taken away, but power that is built on relationships, reputation, knowledge, and strategic influence is far more resilient. It is the ability to persuade, to inspire, to connect, and to strategize. It is a kind of power that cannot be easily seen or measured, which is why it was so often the tool of choice for those excluded from the formal structures of authority. Medieval women were not powerless. They were masters of a different kind of power, one that we often underestimate today. But how much of this influence was ever recorded? Since this power operated in private conversations, letters, and personal relationships, how much of the political history of the Middle Ages was actually driven by women whose role has been completely erased from the official chronicles? What key decisions, credited to a king or a bishop, were actually the result of advice from a wife, a mother, or a sister? And are we still systematically undervaluing these forms of soft power in our own political and corporate worlds? Number 16, can a community be a fortress? We celebrate the individual, the self-made person, the lone genius, but this is a very modern idea. For A medieval woman, individualism was a luxury she could not afford. Her survival, her safety, and her success depended almost entirely on her community. For women in a world that offered them little formal protection, their network was their fortress. They built and maintained these networks with skill and intention. This was true at every level of society. For a peasant woman, the community was the village. Women worked together in the fields during planting and harvesting. They shared the tasks of childcare, cooking, and mending. When a woman was giving birth, it was the other women of the village, the midwives and neighbors, who attended her. When a family fell on hard times, it was the community that supported them. This was not just about friendship. It was a sophisticated system of mutual aid. The bonds between women were a form of social insurance. In her book, The Ties That Bound Peasant Families in Medieval England, historian Barbara Hannawalt shows how these communal ties were essential for the survival of the rural population. In the towns and cities, this principle took a more formal shape in the form of guilds. While most major guilds were dominated by men, women had their own, particularly in trades like spinning, weaving, and brewing at one time. Alewife or brewster was a standard female profession. These guilds were not just for business. They were social safety nets. They set quality standards, regulated prices, and protected their members from outside competition. But they also provided for members who fell ill, supported the widows and orphans of deceased members, and paid for funerals. A woman's guild was her union, her insurance company, and her social club all rolled into one. It was a fortress of mutual support in a precarious urban world. Even in the aristocracy, where women might seem more isolated, these networks were crucial. Noblewomen maintained extensive correspondence with their female relatives and friends. These letters were not just for gossip. They were for sharing information, arranging strategic marriages for their children, and asking for political favors. When a noblewoman moved to her husband's castle, often in a foreign land, her connections back home were her lifeline. These female networks crisscrossed Europe, forming a web of influence and information that ran parallel to the formal male-dominated lines of power. This wisdom is a powerful antidote to our modern epidemic of loneliness. It reminds us that resilience is not an individual trait, but a collective one. The medieval woman understood that her strength did not come just from within herself, but from the web of relationships she was a part of. She invested time and energy in maintaining these bonds because she knew her life depended on them. It was a practical, unsentimental form of community that was built on shared work, mutual obligation, and trust. Today, we often see community as something to be consumed. We join a group or attend an event. This medieval wisdom suggests that community is something to be built through daily acts of mutual support and shared responsibility. It's the neighbor you can borrow a cup of sugar from, the friend who will watch your kids in an emergency, the colleague who will support you at work. It is the fortress we build together, one relationship at a time. But what do we not know about these female communities? Since so many of their interactions were verbal and informal, how can historians ever fully reconstruct the texture and importance of these networks? Were there secret codes or languages used by women in their letters to communicate sensitive political information past the eyes of male censors? And how did women navigate the rivalries and betrayals that must have also been a part of these close-knit communities? Number 15, what does it mean to see the world in a grain of sand? In our data-driven world, we look for the big picture, the grand theory, the universal law. We value the abstract, the systematic, the scalable, but many medieval women mystics taught a different way of knowing. They practiced a kind of radical attention to the small, the particular, the ordinary. They found the entire universe in a single concrete thing. This was not about ignoring the big picture. It was about understanding that the only way to truly access it was through the specific. Julian of Norwich is the ultimate teacher of this wisdom. In one of the most famous passages from her revelations of divine love, she describes a vision where God shows her a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. She is told that this small thing is all that is made. She marvels that it does not fall into nothingness, it is so small. And she is given an answer, it lasts and ever shall, for God loves it. And so all things have their being through the love of God. This is a profound theological and philosophical statement. Julian did not need a grand cosmic vision of swirling galaxies to understand the nature of creation and divine love. She found it all in a hazelnut. She practiced a kind of spiritual microscopy, focusing her attention with such intensity on one small, ordinary object that it revealed the deepest truths of the universe. This is a way of seeing that values the particular over the general. It insists that God or truth or meaning is not found out there in some abstract realm, but right here in the tangible, touchable reality of the world around us. This was a common thread among female mystics. While male scholastic theologians were building vast logical systems to explain God, women like Hadewich of Antwerp or Mechthild of Magdeburg were writing passionate poetic works grounded in the specific imagery of daily life love, thirst, a flowing stream, a noble garment. They were not afraid of the emotional, the embodied, the particular. Their spirituality was not about escaping the world, but about finding the divine woven into its very fabric. This wisdom challenges our obsession with scale and abstraction. We are taught to think globally, to look for macro trends, to find the one-size-fits-all solution. But what do we miss when we do this? We miss the texture of individual lives. We miss the importance of local context. We miss the profound truths that can only be found in paying close attention to the small things. This is a call to find the sacred in the mundane, to see the whole world in the face of a friend, to understand the economy by talking to a single shop owner, to find joy not in a grand future plan, but in a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning. It is a reminder that the hazelnut is enough. What can we learn from this today? It is a form of mindfulness. It is a way of resisting the constant pressure for more, bigger, faster. It is an invitation to slow down and truly see what is right in front of us. The mystics were not being simple. They were being incredibly sophisticated. They understood that the universal is not the opposite of the particular, it is revealed through it. But what are the limits of this knowledge? How much of the focus on the small and the domestic in women's mystical writing was a result of their social confinement, their exclusion from the big world of politics and theology? Is it possible that this hazelnut wisdom was a brilliant adaptation to their circumstances, a way of turning a limitation into a unique form of spiritual insight? And what happens when this intense focus on the particular prevents us from seeing the larger systemic injustices that also shape our world? Number 14, must the body be a battleground? Our relationship with the human body is often a conflicted one. We either discipline it and try to control it, or we indulge it. It is a source of shame or an object of vanity. It is a battleground for competing ideologies about health, beauty, and morality. But what if the body was not a problem to be solved, but a source of knowledge to be listened to? Some medieval women pioneered a view of the body that was remarkably integrated and holistic, a stark contrast to the rigid dualism of body and soul that often dominated male theological thought. Hildegard of Bingen's medical and scientific writings are a testament to this. For her, the body was a microcosm of the universe. The same elements that made up the cosmos, fire, air, water, earth, also made up the human body in the form of the four humors. And health was a state of balance, not just within the body, but between the body and the natural world. Sickness arose from imbalance. Her cures were not just about treating a symptom, but about restoring the whole person to harmony with their environment. This included diet, herbal remedies, and even the use of certain gems and stones. It was a deeply ecological view of health. The body was not a separate, flawed vessel for the soul. It was a part of creation, and its well-being was a reflection of the well-being of the cosmos. Even more radical was the work attributed to a woman known as Trotula of Salerno. In the 11th or 12th century, the medical school of Salerno in Italy was the most advanced in Europe. A collection of texts on women's health, known as the Trotula, became the most influential work on the subject for centuries. While the exact authorship is debated by historians, the texts are clearly grounded in the practical experience of female practitioners. The Trotula deals with menstruation, childbirth, infertility, and cosmetics with a straightforward, practical, and non-judgmental tone. It recognized that men as well as women could be the cause of infertility, or a revolutionary idea at the time. It offered practical advice from herbal remedies to soothe menstrual pain, to techniques for repairing perineal tears after childbirth. What is so powerful about the Trotula is that it treats the female body not as a source of sin or temptation, as was common in religious texts, but as a subject worthy of scientific inquiry and compassionate care. It takes women's pain seriously. It listens to the body's signals and seeks to understand them. It is a wisdom that is profoundly embodied. It refuses to separate the physical from the intellectual or the spiritual. This wisdom is a powerful corrective to our own lingering discomfort with our bodies. It asks us to stop seeing the body as an adversary to be conquered youth through extreme diets, punishing exercise regimes, or anti-aging treatments. Instead, it invites us to see the body as a partner, an intelligent system that is constantly giving us feedback. Pain, fatigue, hunger, joy, these are not just random sensations, they are information. They are a form of knowledge. The women healers of the Middle Ages understood that the first step to healing was to listen with respect and without judgment to the story the body was telling. But what knowledge has been lost, the rise of university-trained male physicians led to the marginalization of female healers and midwives. How many effective, non-invasive treatments for women's health issues were lost when these traditions were broken? Was the attribution of the trachea to a single woman, trachea, an attempt by later male scholars to contain and control a body of knowledge that was actually developed by a community of female practitioners? And how much of our own modern medicine is still hampered by a fundamental distrust or misunderstanding of the female body? Number 13, what if your job is not your identity? We live in a world where the first question we often ask a new person is, what do you do? Our work, our profession, our career, this is how we define ourselves and others. Our identity is tied to our productivity and our professional achievements. But medieval women offer a different model. For most of them, their work was not a single, distinct category. It was a fluid and integrated part of their lives, inseparable from their family, their community, and their identity as a woman. Consider the wife of a skilled craftsman or merchant in a medieval town. Her identity was not weaver or baker or accountant. Her identity was wife of a craftsman, but within that role, she performed a dozen different jobs. She might manage the household finances, supervise apprentices, order raw materials, and sell the finished goods in the shop front. She was a partner in the family business in every sense. In her book, Medieval Women in Towns and Cities, historian Marianne Kowaleski details how crucial women's labor was to the urban economy. Yet, their work was often invisible in the official records because it fell under the umbrella of the husband's trade. A woman's professional life was not a separate career path, it was woven into the fabric of her domestic and family life. This integration of roles meant that work was not something that happened in a separate place or a separate time. It was part of the rhythm of daily life. The home was also a workshop, the family was also a business unit. An alewife brewed beer in her own kitchen and sold it from her own front door. A woman raising silkworms did it as part of her household chores. There was no concept of work-life balance, because work and life were not seen as two opposing forces that needed to be balanced. They were one and the same. This might sound oppressive to our modern ears, and in many ways it was limiting. But it also contained like a hidden wisdom. It protected women from tying their entire sense of, self-worth to a single professional role. Their identity was more holistic. It was composed of their skills, their family relationships, their role in the community, and their faith. A woman's value is not determined solely by her economic output in a specific trade. This created a kind of resilience. If the family business failed, her identity was not destroyed. It was broader and more deeply rooted than a job title. This medieval perspective challenges us to question our own obsession with professional identity. What happens to our sense of self when we get laid off? What happens when we retire? If our job is our entire identity, then the loss of that job can be a catastrophic loss of self. The wisdom of the medieval woman suggests a more integrated life, where our work is just one part of a larger whole. It encourages us to cultivate a sense of identity that is rooted not just in what we do for money, but in our relationships, our passions, our communities, and our values. It is a more stable foundation for a meaningful life. But what was the true cost of this system? By subsuming women's work under the identity of their husbands, did this model make it easier for their economic contributions to be undervalued and ignored by history? How did women who were single or widowed and who had to be the public face of their own business navigate a world that had no clear category for them? And is it possible that our modern separation of work and life, for all its faults, has also been a necessary step for women to gain economic independence and professional recognition in their own right? Number 12. When is it smarter to be the roots, not the branches? We are obsessed with visibility. We want to be seen. We want recognition. We want our names on the project, our faces in the photo. We think of power and influence as something that happens out in the open on the branches of the tree where everyone can see the fruit. But medieval women often cultivated a different kind of power, a quieter, deeper, more foundational power. They were the roots of the tree, invisible underground, but absolutely essential for the life of the whole organism. This was the power of the chatelaine, the lady of the castle, while her husband, the lord, was the public face of power of the branches, dispensing justice, leading armies, and making political alliances. She was the roots. She was responsible for the entire domestic economy of the castle, which was not a home but a massive, complex organization. She managed the food supplies, the textiles, the finances, and the staff. She was the logistics expert, the HR department, and the chief operating officer. Without her work, the entire enterprise would collapse. The Lord's visible power was entirely dependent on her invisible labor. This root-like power was also found in the convents. An abbess, like Hildegard of Bingen, was certainly a visible figure. But the real strength of her community at Rupertsberg was the collective work of all the nuns. Many of these women were skilled artists who created the stunning illuminated manuscripts that accompanied Hildegard's writings. We do not know their individual names. They were the roots. They did the painstaking, detailed work of copying texts and creating art that preserved and transmitted knowledge. Their labor was collective and often anonymous, but without it, the great works of their abbess would never have survived. They chose the power of the collective foundation over the glory of individual recognition. This wisdom is about recognizing the immense power of foundational work. It is the work that doesn't get the glory, but makes everything else possible. It's the project manager who keeps the team on track, the caregiver who allows someone else to have a public career, the researcher who provides the data for the big discovery. In our culture, we tend to celebrate the person who stands on the stage, not the people who built the stage. Medieval women understood that being the roots was a strategic choice. It was often safer. The branches are exposed to the wind and the storm. The visible leader is the first target in a conflict. The roots, however, are protected. By working behind the scenes, by managing the essential resources, by being the indispensable foundation, women could wield enormous influence without making themselves a target. Their power was less glorious, but it was often more secure and more enduring. This is not a call for women to return to invisible labor. It is a call for all of us to recognize and value the power of the roots. It asks us to look at our own organizations and communities and ask, who is doing the foundational work? And are they being honored for it? It also asks us to consider, in our own lives, whether our desire for visible recognition is always the most effective way to make a difference. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to be the one making sure the whole system is nourished and stable from the ground up. But what are the dangers of this model? Does a focus on being the roots risk glorifying self-sacrifice and trapping people in supportive but unfulfilling roles? How many brilliant women had their individual contributions co-opted or claimed by the male branches they were supporting? And is it possible to create a world where both the roots and the branches are seen, valued, and celebrated equally? Number 11. How can silence be an argument? In a world saturated with noise, we believe that to be heard, you must be loud. We fill every available space with words, with opinions, with content. Silence is seen as emptiness, a void, a sign of weakness, or a lack of conviction. But in the highly coded and constrained world of medieval women, silence was not an absence. It was a tool. It could be a shield, a statement, or even a weapon. They were masters of strategic silence. For many women, silence was first and foremost a form of protection. In a world where a woman's spoken word could be used against her, where she could be accused of being a scold, a gossip, or a heretic, choosing not to speak was a way of retaining control. It was a refusal to play a game where the rules were rigged against you. The Cistercian nuns of the 12th century, for example, practiced a form of monastic silence. While this was for spiritual reasons, it also had a social effect. It created a space free from the verbal jockeying and political maneuvering of the outside world. It was a silence that was peaceful and communal, but silence could also be an act of defiance. When a woman was expected to speak to agree, to consent, to flatter her refusal to do so could be a powerful political statement. Consider a queen or a high-ranking noblewoman in a council meeting. She might not have a formal vote, but her presence was required. If she disapproved of a decision, She could not always voice her dissent openly without risking a major conflict. But her silence, her refusal to offer the expected words of support, would have been noticed by everyone in the room. It was a quiet veto, a form of passive resistance that was subtle but unmistakable. As historian Pauline Stafford has noted in her work on early medieval queens, a queen's presence and her demeanor, including her silence, were key parts of her political toolkit. Perhaps the most dramatic use of silence was in the face of interrogation, when women like Joan of Arc or the Beguine Marguerite Porete were tried for heresy. Their inquisitors demanded that they speak, that they confess, that they renounce their beliefs. In these high-stakes encounters, silence could be a profound argument. It was a refusal to recognize the authority of the court. It was a statement that their conscience and their relationship with God were not subject to the judgment of these men. It was a way of saying, you have no power over the most important part of me. It often led to their execution, but it was a way of dying with their integrity intact. Their final silence was their ultimate testimony. This wisdom challenges our assumption that influence requires speech. It asks us to think about the power of withholding our words. In a business meeting, the person who speaks last or not at all often holds the most power. In a negotiation, a moment of silence can be more persuasive than 1,000 words. In a personal conflict, refusing to engage in a shouting match can de-escalate the situation and retain your dignity. Silence creates a space for others to reveal themselves. It can be a sign not of weakness, but of deep confidence and control. Medieval women knew that what you don't say can be just as important as what you do. But how do we interpret silence in the historical record? When a woman is silent in the Chronicles, is it by her own choice, a strategic act? Or is it because the male chronicler simply did not think her words were worth recording? How many defiant silences have been misinterpreted by history as passive agreement? And in our own noisy world, how can we relearn the art of using silence effectively without simply being ignored or silenced by others? Number 10, is it possible to build a life in the cracks of the system? Systems are designed to be total. They have rules and categories for everyone. You are a wife or a nun. You are a peasant or a noble. You are a master or an apprentice. The system tells you who you are and what you can do. But what if you don't fit into any of the available boxes? The wisdom of some medieval women was to not try to fit. Instead, they found the cracks, the loopholes, the overlooked spaces in the system, and they built a life there. The life of a medieval widow is a fascinating example. Under the system of coverture, a married woman had very few legal rights. She was covered by her husband's legal identity. But when her husband died, something remarkable happened. A widow emerged from that legal shadow. She could inherit and control property. She could run her husband's business. She could sue and be sued in court. As historian Barbara Hannawalt has shown, widowhood, while often economically precarious, could also be a time of unprecedented legal and economic autonomy for a woman. It was a crack in the patriarchal system. Many widows chose not to remarry precisely because they did not want to give up this newfound independence. They built a life for themselves in this legal gray area that the system had not fully accounted for. Then there were women who lived on the literal and social margins. In cities, there were spaces that were less regulated, where a woman could make a living in ways that were not strictly controlled by guilds or city authorities. Women worked as street vendors, as moneylenders, as keepers of boarding houses. These were often insecure and low-status occupations, but they offered a degree of freedom from the rigid hierarchies of the formal economy. They were building a life in the economic cracks. This was also true in the world of knowledge. While universities were closed to women, this did not mean women stopped learning or teaching. The convent was one such space, but there were others. Women ran informal dam schools in their homes. They acted as private tutors, and in some fields like medicine, their practical experience-based knowledge existed alongside the formal, text-based knowledge of the universities. They were not licensed physicians, but they were the healers that most people, especially other women, turned to. They were operating in the cracks of the professionalized medical system. This wisdom is about the art of improvisation. It's about seeing the official system not as the only reality, but as a rigid structure full of gaps and opportunities. It is a mindset of creative adaptation. When the front door is locked, you look for an open window, a side entrance, or a loose board in the fence. This is the wisdom of the entrepreneur who spots a niche market that the big corporations have ignored. It's the wisdom of the community organizer who uses an obscure zoning law to stop an unwanted development. It's the wisdom of anyone who has ever had to make a way out of no way. The women who lived in the cracks were resourceful and resilient. They had to be. Their lives were not easy or secure, but they were often more free than their counterparts who lived squarely within the prescribed roles. They teach us that the most interesting and innovative things often happen not in the center of the system, but at its edges, in the spaces that are forgotten, ignored, or underestimated. But what was the true price of living in the cracks? For every widow who thrived, how many were left destitute and vulnerable without a male protector? Were the women on the margins celebrated for their independence, or were they viewed with suspicion and often accused of crimes like witchcraft or prostitution? And by focusing on these exceptional cases, do we risk forgetting that for the vast majority of women, the system was not a thing to be cleverly navigated, but a wall that could not be climbed? Number 9. What if beauty is a strategy, not a virtue? We have a complicated relationship with beauty. We are told it's only skin deep, yet we are bombarded with images of a very specific, often unattainable ideal. For women, beauty can feel like both a currency and a trap. But what if we thought about it differently? What if beauty was not a moral category, a sign of goodness or vanity, but a strategic tool? Medieval women, particularly in the noble classes, understood this perfectly. Beauty, and the careful management of one's appearance, was a key part of the political and social toolkit. This was not about simple attractiveness, it was about the entire performance of status, power, and identity. A queen's clothing, her jewels, her hairstyle, these were not matters of personal taste. They were political statements. The richness of her fabrics advertised the wealth of her kingdom. The style of her dress could signal a political alliance with another country. At a time when most people were illiterate, visual symbols were incredibly important. A queen's appearance was a text that everyone could read. It communicated her legitimacy, her power, and the stability of her husband's reign. In her book, Queen of the Mean Screen, historian Muriel Press discusses how queens like Isabella of France used their lavish courts and personal splendor as a form of political theater. This strategic use of appearance was also detailed in texts like the Trotula. Alongside medical remedies, the book contains detailed recipes for cosmetics. There are instructions on how to dye hair, how to clear the skin, how to whiten teeth, and how to use makeup. These were not presented as frivolous vanities, but as part of a woman's health and self-care. They were tools to help a woman present herself effectively in the world. For a noble woman, looking healthy and beautiful was part of her duty. It was a sign of her good breeding and the health of her lineage, which was crucial for securing a good marriage and producing heirs. A pale complexion, for instance, was not just fashionable. It was a status symbol, a sign that you did not have to perform manual labor in the sun. This was a highly calculated art form. Women were not just passively being beautiful. They were actively constructing an image to achieve specific goals. An arranged marriage was a political and economic transaction, and a woman's appearance was part of her value in that transaction. It was a pragmatic and often unsentimental calculation. Beauty was a resource, and like any resource, it had to be managed wisely. This wisdom asks us to strip away the moral judgments we place on appearance and instead see it as a form of communication. The way we dress, the way we present ourselves, these are choices. They send signals. They can be used consciously to build authority, to show respect, to fit in, or to stand out. The medieval noblewoman understood that her image was a tool she could use to navigate her world and exercise a form of agency. It was not the most powerful tool she had, but it was one of them, and she was smart enough to use it. This is not to say we should be slaves to fashion or beauty standards. It is to say that we should be conscious of the power of visual communication and use it with intention, rather than being used by it. It is about moving from being the object of the gaze to being the author of our own image. But where did this leave women who did not fit the ideal? How did women who were not born with conventional beauty or wealth navigate a world that placed so much value on it? Was the emphasis on external appearance a way for the patriarchal system to distract women from seeking more substantial forms of power? And how much of the pressure to be beautiful was an external demand versus an internalized desire? Number 8, can you be both a mystic and a manager? We like to put people in boxes. You are either a spiritual person or a practical person. You are a visionary or an executive. You are an artist or an administrator. Our world tells us we have to choose, but the life of a medieval abbess shows this to be a false choice. The most successful abbesses were women who were both. They were mystics and managers, spiritual leaders, and savvy businesswomen. They had to be. Hildegard of Bingen is the supreme example. We remember her for her extraordinary visions, her haunting music, and her profound theological writings. She was, without a doubt, a spiritual giant, but she was also a brilliant administrator. She founded 2 new monasteries at Rupertsberg and Eibingen. This was a massive undertaking. She had to negotiate for the land, raise the funds, oversee the construction, and recruit the nuns. It was a startup, and she was the CEO. She managed the considerable assets of her convents, which included farmlands, vineyards, and mills. She was an expert in herbal medicine, and her monastery's garden was not just for beauty, but was a functioning pharmacy that served the local community. She was also a shrewd politician. As we've seen, she corresponded with the most powerful men in Europe, giving them advice that was both spiritual and intensely practical. She fought with the local church authorities to defend the rights and autonomy of her convent. She managed a large and complex organization of women, dealing with their spiritual needs, their physical health, and their interpersonal conflicts. Her life was a constant balancing act between the contemplative and the active, the mystical and the mundane. This was true for abbesses across Europe. An abbess was responsible for the spiritual well-being of her nuns, leading them in prayer and study. But she was also the head of a major economic institution. Convents were often significant landowners, and the abbess was in charge of managing those lands, collecting rents, and selling produce. The Abbey of Shaftesbury in England, for example, was one of the wealthiest landowners in the country, and its abbess was a major political figure. She had to be literate, numerate, and legally astute. This wisdom teaches us that the spiritual and the practical are not opposing forces. They are 2 sides of the same coin. A vision is useless without a plan to execute it. A great idea is worthless without the organizational skill to make it a reality. The abbesses knew that for their spiritual community to thrive, it had to be well managed. The lights had to be kept on, the bills had to be paid, the roof had to be fixed. They did not see this practical work as a distraction from their spiritual life. They saw it as the necessary foundation for it. In our own lives, we often feel torn between our ideals and the practical demands of the world. We separate our work self from our real self. The wisdom of the abbess suggests that this is a mistake. It is possible to be both a visionary and a pragmatist. It is possible to bring our deepest values into our most practical work. In fact, it is the only way to build something that lasts. True leadership is not just about having a vision. It's about having the skill and the determination to build the structures that will support that vision long after you are gone. But how did these women learn their administrative and financial skills in a world that did not formally educate women in these areas? Did the immense pressure of managing these large institutions ever cause a crisis of faith for these spiritual leaders? And how many potential female mystics were so burdened by the practical demands of their role that they never had the time or space to develop their visionary gifts? Number 7. How can a journey outward also be a journey inward? The travel, for a medieval woman, was rare and dangerous. Most people, men and women, never ventured more than a few miles from the place they were born. A woman's place was considered to be in the home. To travel was to make oneself vulnerable, to step outside the bounds of social protection and convention. Yet, some women undertook extraordinary journeys. They became pilgrims, traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles to religious shrines. And in doing so, they discovered a profound truth. The journey out into the world is also a journey into the self. Marjorie Kempe is the most famous of these female pilgrims. In the early 15th century, this mother of 14 from a town in England decided to embark on a series of pilgrimages. She traveled to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. This was an incredible feat. She faced storms at sea, dishonest travel companions, and suspicion from authorities in every town she visited. She was a middle-aged woman traveling without the protection of a husband, a highly unusual and risky thing to do. But for Marjorie, the physical journey was inseparable from her spiritual one. Each challenge she faced on the road, each time she was robbed or arrested, became a test of her faith. The sights she saw, the holy places in Jerusalem, were not just tourist attractions, they were catalysts for intense emotional and spiritual experiences. The act of walking, of putting one foot in front of the other for weeks and months on end, was a form of moving meditation. It stripped away the distractions of her normal life and forced her to confront her own fears, her own beliefs, and her relationship with God. The journey outward was the landscape for her journey inward. By leaving her home, she found herself. Pilgrimage was one of the few socially acceptable reasons for a woman to travel. It gave her a freedom of movement that she would otherwise never have. For women like Marjorie or the 4th century pilgrim Egeria, who wrote a detailed account of her travels to the Holy Land, pilgrimage was an act of liberation. It was a way to escape the confines of their domestic roles, to see the world, to meet new people, and to have an adventure. It was a way of claiming a physical and spiritual autonomy that was denied to them in their everyday lives. This wisdom resonates deeply with our modern love of travel. We travel to see new things, but we also travel to find ourselves. We go on hikes, we take road trips, we go backpacking. We sense, as the medieval pilgrims did, that there is something about the physical act of journeying that changes us on the inside. It forces us to be resourceful, it exposes us to new perspectives, it removes us from our comfortable routines, and reminds us of what is truly important. The medieval woman pilgrim teaches us that a journey does not have to be a vacation or an escape. It can be a practice, it can be a way of working through a problem, of marking a transition in our lives, or of seeking a deeper understanding of ourselves. It is a reminder that sometimes the only way to solve an internal problem is to put on your shoes and walk out the door. The answers are not always found in sitting still. Sometimes they are found on the road. But what were the unwritten stories of female pilgrimage? For every Marjorie Kempe who told her story, how many thousands of women made these journeys whose experiences are lost to us? What practical networks existed among women to support each other on the pilgrim roads? And was the desire for pilgrimage sometimes a desperate and respectable way for a woman to escape an abusive home or an unhappy marriage? Number 6, what if your legacy is not a thing, but a person? When we think of leaving a legacy, we often think of creating something permanent. A book, a building, a business, a work of art. Something tangible that will carry our name into the future. But for many medieval women, particularly those in the ruling classes, their primary legacy was not an object, but a person, their children. This was not just about the biological act of motherhood. It was about the strategic, political, and cultural act of raising the next generation of leaders. Motherhood was a profession, and it was a form of power that shaped the future of Europe. A queen's most important job was to produce a male heir. This is a fact we all know. But her job did not end at childbirth. She was responsible for the education and upbringing of her children. This gave her immense influence. She chose their tutors. She shaped their religious and moral instruction. She instilled in them the values and political priorities of her own family and homeland. The future king was her student for the first, most formative years of his life. A savvy queen could use this opportunity to build a powerful and lifelong alliance with her son. Blanche of Castile, the mother of King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, is a prime example. When her husband died, Louis was only 12. Blanche became regent of France. She ruled the kingdom with an iron fist, putting down rebellious barons and consolidating royal power. But her most enduring legacy was her son. She raised Louis to be a pious, just, and effective king. He became so revered that he was later canonized as St. Louis. His successful reign was a direct result of her upbringing. She did not just give birth to a king, she made a king. Her legacy was his reign. This power was not just about sons. Noblewomen were also responsible for the education of their daughters. They taught them the skills they would need to be successful wives and mothers in their own right, how to manage a household, how to behave at court, and how to navigate the complex world of dynastic politics. Marriages were alliances, and a well-raised daughter was a crucial political asset. Through their daughters, these women built networks of influence that spanned kingdoms. This wisdom asks us to reconsider what it means to create a legacy. It suggests that perhaps the most powerful and enduring thing we can do is to invest in other people. It is the wisdom of the teacher, the mentor, the parent, the community leader. It is the understanding that our influence can be multiplied exponentially when we pass our knowledge, our values, and our skills on to the next generation. This is a quieter, less ego-driven form of legacy. It does not put your name in the history books. It puts your values into the future. It is not about building a monument to yourself. It is about planting a forest that will grow long after you are gone. In a world that prizes individual achievement, this is a radical idea. It suggests that our greatest work might be the work we do for and through others. It is a long-term strategy, one that requires patience and selflessness, but as the lives of women like Blanche of Castile show, its impact can be world-changing. But what was the emotional cost for these women? How did a mother feel when she had to send her young daughter off to a foreign court to be married for political reasons? When a queen's power was so tied to her son, what happened to her if he turned against her or died young? And by focusing on the legacy of motherhood, do we risk reinforcing the idea that a woman's primary value lies in her ability to produce and raise children? Number 5, is it possible to fight a war with books? When we think of medieval conflict, we think of swords and shields, castles and sieges. But there was another kind of war being fought, a war of ideas, a war over how society should be structured, who should hold power, and what it meant to be human. And in this war, the most powerful weapons were not made of steel, but of ink and parchment. Christine de Pizan, the 15th century writer, was one of its greatest generals. She showed that it is possible to fight a war with books. As we've seen, Christine's The Book of the City of Ladies was a direct assault on the misogynistic literature of her time. But this was not her only battle. She lived during the Hundred Years' War between France and England, a time of immense political chaos and violence in her adopted country of France. She was not a passive observer. She was an active participant in the political debates of her day, using her writing to try and shape public opinion and influence the powerful. She wrote a biography of the French King Charles V, presenting him as a model of wise and just rule. This was a political act, an attempt to create an ideal for the current feuding rulers to aspire to. She wrote a book called The Book of the Body Politic, which was a manual on good governance, addressed to the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. She was, in effect, trying to teach the next king how to do his job properly. Perhaps, most remarkably, she wrote a military manual called the Book of Feats of Arms and of Chivalry. This text, based on classical Roman sources and contemporary practice, was a practical guide to warfare. It covered everything from strategy and tactics to the laws of war. A woman writing a book to teach men how to fight. This was an audacious act. She was stepping into the most masculine of all spheres and claiming a voice of authority. She was arguing that the right way to wage war was not just about brute force, but about discipline, justice, and strategy-H qualities of the mind, which she, as a scholar, possessed. Christine's life work was a demonstration of the power of the written word to challenge injustice, to shape political discourse, and to build a better world. She was not a queen or a noble with an army at her back. Her only power was her intellect and her pen. But she wielded it with courage and skill. She was fighting for the soul of her country and for the dignity of her sex, and her weapons were books. She understood that if you can change the way people think, you can change the world. This wisdom is more relevant today than ever. We live in an age of information warfare, of propaganda and misinformation. The battles that will define our future are being fought on the internet, in the media, and in our classrooms. Christine de Pizan's legacy is a reminder that intellectuals, writers, artists, and journalists are not just commentators on the sidelines. They are combatants in the war of ideas. Writing a well-researched book, a clear-eyed article, or an honest poem can be an act of resistance. It is a way of fighting back against the noise and the lies. It is a way of insisting on clarity, reason, and human dignity. It is a war we can all enlist in, but how effective was she really? Did the powerful men she wrote for actually listen to her advice, or did they see her as a curiosity, a learned woman to be patronized but not taken seriously? How much did she have to censor her own opinions to make them palatable to her male patrons? And if a woman of her genius were alive today, would she be a celebrated public intellectual, or would she be drowned out by the trolls and the noise of social media? Number 4. What if grief is not a disorder, but a skill? Our modern world treats grief as a problem to be solved, a temporary disorder to be managed and, if possible, overcome as quickly as possible. We medicalize it. We have stages we are supposed to move through. We are told to get over it and move on. But what if this is all wrong? What if grief is not a pathology, but a profound human skill? The wisdom of some medieval women suggests that grief is a form of deep connection, a way of holding on to love in the face of loss, and even a source of spiritual insight. The experience of loss was a constant presence in the medieval world. The death of children was common. The plague could wipe out half a village in a matter of months. War was endemic. Those women in particular lived in close proximity to death. They were the primary caregivers for the sick and the dying, and they bore the terrible risks of childbirth. They did not have the luxury of treating grief as an occasional interruption to an otherwise happy life. Grief was woven into the fabric of life itself. As a result, they developed a different relationship with it. For many, grief was not about letting go, but about holding on in a different way. The connection with the dead did not end. It was transformed. This is powerfully expressed in the tradition of female piety and mysticism. Many women mystics, like Julian of Norwich, focused their meditations on the suffering of Christ on the cross. This was not a morbid obsession, it was an act of profound empathy. By entering into the grief of the crucifixion, they felt a deeper connection to the divine. Their capacity for grief was a spiritual gift. We also see this in the social rituals surrounding death. It was women who were responsible for preparing the body for burial. It was women who were the primary mourners. In some cultures, there were professional female mourners who would lead the public expression of grief at a funeral. This was not seen as a loss of control. It was seen as a necessary and important community ritual. It was a skill. The ability to express grief openly and authentically was a way of honoring the dead and helping the entire community to process the loss. And Marjorie Kempe, with her famous public weeping, is an extreme example of this. While her contemporaries often found it disruptive, her crying was, for her, a form of prayer. It was her body's way of expressing her overwhelming love and sorrow. She was not trying to get over her feelings. She was living in them, and through them, she felt closer to God. This medieval wisdom challenges us to stop running from grief. It asks us to see it not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of love. The pain of loss is a measure of the depth of our connection. To grieve is to be human. Instead of trying to suppress it or pathologize it, what if we learn to befriend it? What if we saw it as a skill to be cultivated, the skill of remembering, the skill of honoring, the skill of carrying our love for someone even after they are gone? It is a quieter, slower, and more compassionate approach to loss. It does not promise to make the pain go away. It promises to help us find meaning within it. But how do we distinguish between healthy grief and debilitating depression in the historical context? Was the intense focus on suffering and some forms of female piety a genuine spiritual path, or was it a socially acceptable outlet for the immense trauma and loss these women experienced in their daily lives? And did the public performance of grief by women sometimes give men an excuse to suppress their own emotions, creating a damaging emotional imbalance between the sexes? Number 3 is a garden of book. In a largely illiterate society, how do you store and transmit complex knowledge? We think of books, of written texts, but for many medieval women, knowledge was stored in other forms. It was stored in songs and recipes, in patterns of weaving, and most profoundly, it was stored in the garden. For a woman, a garden was not just a source of food or beauty, it was a library. It was a living text of practical, medicinal, and even spiritual knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. Every plant in a woman's garden had a story and a purpose. This was her pharmacopoeia. She knew that foxglove used carefully could treat a heart condition. She knew that chamomile would calm a fretful child and that yarrow could stop bleeding. This knowledge was incredibly complex. It involved knowing how to identify plants, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and what the correct dosage was. This was a science. A woman's garden was her laboratory and her reference library. The plants themselves were the pages of the book. The garden was also a book of household management. A woman knew which plants could be used for dyeing textiles, weld, for yellow, madder for red, woad for blue. She knew which herbs would preserve meat and which would keep pests out of the stored grain. She knew which vegetables would store well through the long winter months. The layout of her garden was a practical text on self-sufficiency and survival. It was a calendar with its cycles of planting and harvesting marking the passage of the year. And for some, like the mystic Hildegard of Bingen, the garden was a book of theology. Her concept of viriditas, or greening power, was central to her worldview. She saw the vitality and life force of the plant world as a direct expression of the divine. For her, a garden was a place of spiritual contemplation. By observing the life cycle of a plant The seed, the sprout, the flower, the fruit, the decay, and the rebirth sea, she could read the story of creation, fall, and redemption. The garden was a sacred text, a direct revelation of God's presence in the world. This wisdom is about recognizing that knowledge can be embodied and ecological, not just abstract and textual. It challenges our hierarchy of information, which places the written word at the top. The woman in her garden possessed a deep, practical, and multi-layered knowledge that was just as sophisticated as the knowledge of a male scholar in his library. But her knowledge was alive, it was interactive, it was a conversation with the natural world. This is a call for us to reconnect with this kind of embodied knowledge, to learn by doing, by touching, by observing the world around us. It is an invitation to plant a seed, to cook a meal from scratch, to learn a practical skill. It is a reminder that our screens and our books are not the only sources of wisdom. There is a library in the soil beneath our feet, if we only remember how to read it. But how much of this plant-based knowledge passed down through female lines for generations was lost forever during the witch trials, when women who were skilled herbalists were targeted and killed? As we face an ecological crisis, what crucial information about sustainable agriculture and local ecosystems have we lost by devaluing this form of traditional garden-based knowledge? And is it possible to ever fully translate this rich, embodied wisdom into the written, data-driven language of modern science without losing its soul? Number 2, what if you have to invent a language to tell the truth? What happens when the language you have been given is not big enough to hold your experience? What happens when the words you are supposed to use to describe your life, your faith, your body, your world feel false or inadequate? Do you stay silent, or do you do something more radical? Do you invent a new language? Many medieval women, particularly the mystics, found that the official language of theology and philosophy created by and for men could not contain their reality. So they broke it, they twisted it, they invented new words and new ways of speaking to express the inexpressible. Hildegard of Bingen is again a pioneer here. She famously invented her own lingua ignota, or unknown language. It consisted of over 1,000 nouns, an alphabet, and a few connecting words. We don't know exactly how she used it, but it seems to have been a private spiritual language for her and her nuns. Why would she do this? Perhaps it was a way of creating a unique identity for her community. Perhaps she believed that the holy mysteries she experienced in her visions could not be contained in ordinary German or Latin. To speak of the divine, she needed a divine language. It was a radical claim that the existing languages were not enough. But this invention of language was not always so literal. It was also about creating new metaphors, new images, new ways of talking about God and the soul. The official language of the church was patriarchal. God was King, Lord, Father. He was a distant, powerful male figure. But the female mystics, in their writings, created a different language. And Julian of Norwich, famously, spoke of God our Mother. She wrote about Jesus as a mother who feeds us with his own body in the Eucharist, just as a mother feeds her child. This was not a rejection of the father language. It was an expansion of it. It was a way of saying your language is only half the story. You are missing this entire dimension of divine love that is nurturing, compassionate, and intimate. Women mystics like Hadewitsch of Antwerp and Macfield of Magdeburg wrote in the vernacular in Dutch and German, not Latin. And they used the language of courtly love and romance poetry to describe their relationship with God. They spoke of the soul as the bride and God as the lover. They wrote with a passion, an emotional intensity, and an eroticism that was shocking and new. They were taking the language of secular human love and using it to describe the most profound spiritual experiences. They were claiming that the body and its passions were not an obstacle to holiness, but a pathway to it. They had to invent a new spiritual vocabulary because the old one, with its fear of the body and the feminine, was simply not true to their experience. This wisdom is about the power of language to shape reality. We do not just use language, it uses us. It shapes what we can think, what we can feel, and what we can imagine. When our language is limited, our world is limited. The act of creating new words, new metaphors, and new stories is a revolutionary act. It is how we break out of old ways of thinking. It is the work of poets, of activists, of prophets. It is the work of anyone who has ever felt that the world is bigger and more mysterious than our words for it. Today, we are constantly creating new language to describe new realities and in technology, in social justice, in psychology. This medieval wisdom reminds us that this is not just a modern phenomenon, it is a timeless human need. When the old maps no longer describe the territory, you have to draw a new one. And to do that, you often have to invent a new language. But how did these women get away with it? How did they use such radical, borderline, heretical language without being silenced more often than they were? Did their status as visionaries give them a special permission to break the rules of language that others did not have? And how many women had profound experiences but remained silent because they simply could not find any words, old or new, to describe them? Number one, can you win a game you weren't meant to play? This is the fundamental question that underlies all the others. The world of medieval Europe was a game of power, of status, of survival. And it was a game whose rules were written by men, for men. Women were not meant to be major players. They were meant to be tokens, prizes, or assistants to the male players. Yet, time and time again, women found ways to not just play the game, but to win it. And they did it by being smarter, more creative, and more resilient than the system ever expected them to be. They won by mastering the rules better than the men. A woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine knew the laws of inheritance and the complex web of feudal obligations inside and out. She used the system's own rules to her advantage to protect her lands and her power. They won by creating their own games alongside the official one. The Beguines, seeing that the game of the church and the game of marriage offered them limited options, simply built their own game, with their own rules, in their own communities. They won by changing the object of the game. While men were often playing a game of conquest and glory, women were playing a long game of survival, stability, and legacy. A queen like Blanche of Castile wasn't just trying to win the next battle, she was trying to build a kingdom that would last for her son and her grandchildren. They won by using tools the other players didn't even recognize as being part of the game. They used influence instead of authority, they used community as a fortress. They used their knowledge of healing, their management of the household, and their control over their own stories as sources of real power. They were playing a different, more subtle, and often more sophisticated game. The forgotten wisdom of these medieval women is not a collection of quaint historical tidbits. It is a masterclass in strategy for anyone who has ever found themselves playing on an uneven field. It is a testament to the power of resilience, creativity, and courage in the face of overwhelming structural disadvantages. They were not, as a group, victims. They were players. They were strategists. They were survivors. They lost many battles. But the fact that we know their names at all, that their words and their works have survived for centuries, is a sign that they ultimately won the war. The war to be remembered, the war to have a voice. Their lives are not a simple story of oppression. It is a complex story of negotiation, resistance, and triumph. They teach us that power is not always where you think it is. They teach us that weakness can be a disguise for a different kind of strength. They teach us that the most profound changes often come not from a frontal assault, but from the patient, clever, and courageous work of building a different world in the cracks of the old one. They were playing a game they weren't meant to play, and in so many ways that matter, they won. But who are the women whose names we have lost? For every Eleanor or Hildegard, how many thousands of equally brilliant women were erased from the record by time, by accident, or by design? What other strategies for survival and success did they develop that we cannot see, because they were too subtle or too private to be written down? And what game, in our own time, are we being told we are not meant to play, and what forgotten wisdom will we need to find in order to win it?